The dust of the high plains was a language Malachi Brook understood better than the words of men. It spoke of drought in its fine pale powder, of coming rain in its dark cloying scent. Today, it spoke of nothing but a stubborn wind and the endless aching quiet of his own life. He stood on the porch of his small ranch house, a silhouette burned dark against the vast, bleached canvas of the sky, watching his horse. Sterling wasn't grazing. He wasn't switching his tail at the persistent flies or dozing in the long shadow of the solitary oak that dominated the western pasture. He was working. The horse, a powerful gray with a coat that shimmered like hammered silver in the unforgiving sun, was digging. Hooves, meant for thundering across open range, struck the earth with a frantic, obsessive rhythm. Dirt flew in dark arcs, piling in a mound beside a steadily deepening hole. This had been going on for 3 days. At first, Malachi had dismissed it. A horse might paw at the ground for salt, for a cooler patch of earth. But this was different. This was a fever. A compulsion that had taken root in the animal's mind. Malachi had tried to lead him away, but Sterling would only return, his eyes wide and strange, drawn back to that specific patch of ground beneath the ancient oak as if by an invisible rope. The sight pricked at the edges of Malachi's own solitude, stirring a disquiet he couldn't name. He was a man accustomed to the predictable cycles of the land, sun up, sun down, the turn of the seasons. This was an aberration, a note of discord in the familiar hymn of his existence. His life was a fortress of routine, built to keep the ghosts of the past at bay. He'd bought this land, far from anyone and anything, to be the master of his own silence. The world had taken enough from him. He had no desire to ask it for anything more. But the horse, his only steady companion, was now clawing at the earth as if trying to unbury a memory, and the sound of it, the dull, rhythmic thud of hoof on soil, was beginning to sound like a knock on a door he had long since bolted shut. He pushed himself off the porch railing, his worn leather boots sinking softly into the dust. He walked not toward the horse, but along the fence line, his eyes scanning the horizon. Nothing. Just the shimmer of heat rising from the plains, the distant, hazy blue of the mountains that walled them in. The town of Redemption was a day's ride east, a place he visited only when supplies ran low, a place of noise and judgment he could do without. Here, there was only the wind, the sun, and now, this unnerving mystery. He leaned against a fence post, the rough wood a familiar comfort against his palm, and watched. Sterling's breathing was heavy, coming in ragged, frothy snorts. The animal was tireless, driven by a force Malachi couldn't comprehend. It was more than instinct. It felt like a haunting. An animalistic sense of justice, perhaps, a notion so foreign to his experience with men that he could barely form the thought. He thought of the oak tree. It was the oldest thing on this land, a silent witness to generations of lives lived and lost. Its roots ran deep, tangled with the history of the soil. What secret could it possibly hold that a horse would try to tear it from the ground? A chill, unrelated to the evening's approach, traced its way down his spine. He had the distinct, irrational feeling that Sterling hadn't found something, but that something had found Sterling. And whatever it was meant to be hidden. As the sun began to bleed its fiery orange and purple across the western sky, casting the oak and the horse in dramatic silhouette, Malachi knew he could not ignore it any longer. The quiet of his life had been a fragile piece, and it was now broken. The sound of his horse's digging was the prelude to a storm he felt gathering in his own soul. It was the sound of the past, clawing its way back to the surface. The next morning, the digging had not stopped. The hole was deeper, a raw wound in the earth. Malachi approached, carrying a bucket of water. Sterling ignored it, his coat matted with sweat and dirt, his muscles trembling with exertion. Malachi spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, stroking the powerful neck, but the horse was inconsolable, his focus absolute. With a sigh that seemed to draw up all the weariness in his bones, Malachi fetched a shovel from the barn. If the horse wouldn't be moved, He would have to join him. He had to know. The metallic scrape of the shovel biting into the earth was a stark, jarring sound. He worked beside the animal, the man and the horse a strange diptych of shared obsession. The sun climbed, beating down on his neck. Sweat stung his eyes. The hole grew. He was a rancher, not a grave digger, but the work felt grimly similar. He was disturbing a long rest, and the air itself felt heavy with protest. He was just about to give up, to concede to the madness of it all, when the shovel struck something that wasn't stone or root. It made a dull, hollow thud, a sound of wood. Sterling stopped instantly, his head shooting up, ears pricked. He whinnied, a low, guttural sound of, what? Recognition? Relief? Malachi's heart hammered against his ribs. He dropped to his knees, scraping away the last few inches of soil with his bare hands. His fingers brushed against splintered dark wood. It was a chest, small, bound with rusted iron straps, and heavy. He worked his fingers under one edge, heaving with all his strength until he broke the suction of the damp earth. He dragged it out of the hole and onto the grass. For a long moment he just stared at it, his breath coming in shallow pants. It was a coffin for secrets. Sterling nudged his shoulder, a surprisingly gentle gesture as if to say, "There, now you see." The lock was old and corroded. He smashed it with the back of the shovel, the sound of splintering wood echoing in the unnatural stillness. He lifted the lid. He didn't know what he expected. Bones, perhaps. A relic of some forgotten tragedy. But it wasn't bones. The chest was filled with neat stacks of U.S. government bonds, thick bundles of cash, and a leather-bound ledger. Beneath it all, tucked into a corner, were several parcels of land deeds, their wax seals still intact. And on top of everything, a single folded envelope addressed in a neat, concise hand, "To whom it may concern." Malachi's blood ran cold. This wasn't some homesteader's buried savings. This was official, this was big, and it was buried on his land. As he reached for the letter, another sound broke the silence. Not the wind, not the horse, but the distant, rhythmic beat of approaching hoof falls. More than one rider, and they were coming fast. He looked up, his hand frozen over the chest. 3 figures on horseback crested the nearby ridge, their forms stark against the bright sky. They weren't neighbors. He recognized the central figure instantly, even from a distance. The cruel set of his shoulders, the way he sat his horse as if it were a throne. Deputy Marshal Silas Ward, Judge Pike's man, Pike's fist. Malachi's mind raced. They weren't here for a social call. They knew. They had to know. He slammed the chest shut, a futile gesture. The hole, the mound of fresh earth, the splintered lock. It was a confession. There was nowhere to run. The riders were closing the distance, their purpose a palpable threat that rolled ahead of them like a dust cloud. He looked at Sterling, who stood his ground, his ears flat against his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The horse knew, too. The men who had buried this secret had come back to reclaim it. The approaching storm arrived in the form of a woman. She rode in on a lathered mare 2 days later, a whirlwind of dust and determination. She dismounted before her horse had even come to a full stop, her boots hitting the ground with an impatient thud. Malachi, who had reburied the chest and spent 2 sleepless nights watching the horizon, met her on the porch, his hand resting warily on the frame of the door. She was younger than he'd expected, but her eyes held a hardness that spoke of an old grief. She carried a worn satchel slung over her shoulder, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Are you Malachi Brooke?" she asked, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the heavy air. He just nodded, his gaze unwavering. "My name is Mercy Whitmore." She paused, as if the name itself should mean something to him. When he offered no reaction, a flicker of frustration crossed her face. "My brother, Thomas Whitmore, worked for Judge Pike. He came out this way a month ago. He never came back." Malachi's stillness became absolute. Thomas Whitmore. The name was vaguely familiar. A young, idealistic clerk, new to town, people had said. a boy who asked too many questions. He sent me letters, Mercy continued, her voice tightening. He was investigating something about money meant for the Cherokee reservation, money that vanished, and land deeds. He said he found proof, that he had to hide it somewhere safe, somewhere no one would ever think to look. He mentioned an old oak tree on the edge of town. This is the only ranch that fits that description. She looked past him, her eyes finding the great oak in the distance. Her gaze was so intense, it was almost a physical force. Malachi felt a wall inside him begin to crumble. He had wanted no part of this. He had built his life on the principle of non-involvement. But this woman, with her fierce grief and her brother's ghost, was pulling him in. Her story laid over the contents of the chest like a map, and suddenly, the jumble of bonds and deeds resolved into a coherent, horrifying picture. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "I want to find my brother," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "And I think you know where to look." It was not a request, it was an accusation. She saw the lie in his silence, the evasion in his posture. He looked from her determined face to the distant oak, the site of his own disturbed peace. The choice was no longer his to make. The truth, it seemed, didn't care if it was wanted. It simply demanded to be known. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. "The horse found it," he said, the words feeling like a betrayal of his own solitude. He wouldn't leave it alone. Mercy's face, a mask of tense control, finally broke. A wave of anguish and vindication washed over her features. "Show me," she whispered. They walked to the oak together, the silence between them thick with unspoken fears. He didn't tell her about the riders he'd seen, the shadow of Silas Ward that now hung over his land. He didn't want to add to her burden, or perhaps he didn't want to admit to himself how much danger he was already in. He led her to the spot, the disturbed earth a darker patch on the sun-scorched grass. This time, when he dug, it was with a different purpose. He was no longer unearthing a mystery, but an answer, a confirmation of a young man's murder. Mercy knelt beside him, her hands clenched into fists, watching every shovelful of dirt as if it were a page in her brother's final chapter. When the chest was revealed once more, she let out a choked sob. It wasn't the coffin she had feared, but it was his tombstone. Malachi pried the lid open again. The contents lay there, a testament to a crime of staggering scale. The stolen wealth of a people, the proof of a conspiracy that reached into the highest office in their small world. Mercy reached in with a trembling hand, pushing aside the stacks of money. She wasn't looking for the gold. She was looking for her brother. Her fingers found the leather-bound ledger and the envelope. She pulled them out, her movements reverent. She opened the letter first. "To whom it may concern," it began. "If you are reading this, I am likely dead. My name is Thomas Whitmore. I have uncovered a crime orchestrated by Judge Harrison Pike. He has systematically stolen government funds allocated to the Cherokee Nation and used them to illegally acquire their ancestral lands through fraudulent deeds. This chest contains the money, the original deeds, and a ledger detailing every transaction. Judge Pike is not a man of law. He is a thief and a murderer. Do not let him bury this truth with me." Mercy read the words aloud, her voice cracking but gaining strength with each sentence. It was her brother's voice, reaching out from the grave, and it filled the air with a terrible clarity. The silence that followed was heavier than any before it. The rustle of the oak leaves sounded like whispers. The vast, empty landscape felt suddenly crowded with ghosts. "He was so brave," Mercy whispered, clutching the letter to her chest. "He tried to do the right thing." "He did," Malachi said, his voice quiet but firm. "And now, so will we." The words surprised him as much as they did her. He, Malachi Brooke, the man who had turned his back on the world, was vowing to enter the fray. In that moment, looking at the evidence of Thomas's courage and Mercy's grief, his own isolation felt like a kind of cowardice. The peace he had sought was a selfish illusion, bought at the cost of ignoring the world's injustices. That peace was over. As if summoned by the thought, the sound returned, the rhythmic beat of hoof falls, closer this time, more menacing. Malachi's head snapped up. It was them, Silas Ward and two other men riding hard, dust pluming behind them. They had seen them, the open chest, the figures kneeling on the ground. There was no hiding it now. "Get back," Malachi said, his voice low and urgent. He pushed Mercy behind him, his body instinctively shielding hers. He grabbed the shovel, its weight a poor substitute for a rifle. Ward reined in his horse just yards away, a cruel smile twisting his lips. His eyes, small and dark like beads of obsidian, flickered from the chest to Malachi and Mercy. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice like gravel. "Looks like you found something that don't belong to you, Brooke. The judge is mighty particular about his property." "This isn't his property," Mercy shot back, her fear eclipsed by a surge of righteous fury. "It belongs to the people he stole it from. This is evidence." Ward chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Evidence," he spat on the ground. "That's a dangerous word for a pretty little thing like you to be throwing around. All I see is a thief and a trespasser. The judge wants that chest, and he wants you two to have a little chat with him about minding your own business." His men fanned out, their hands hovering over the pistols at their hips. The air grew thick, electric with the promise of violence. This was it, the midpoint, the moment where a search for truth became a fight for survival. Malachi's gaze darted around. The open field offered no cover. The oak tree was their only bastion. "The truth doesn't belong to Judge Pike," Malachi said, his voice steady despite the frantic pounding of his heart. He took a step back, pulling Mercy with him, positioning the thick trunk of the oak between them and Ward's men. Ward's smile vanished. "That was your last chance, rancher." He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Give me the chest, or I'll bury you right here next to the clerk." Malachi knew then that there was no negotiation. There was no surrender. To hand over the chest was to hand over Mercy to Pike's brutal justice, to let Thomas Whitmore's sacrifice be for nothing, to let the truth be buried again, this time, forever. He looked at Mercy, at the terrified but resolute set of her jaw. He looked at the shovel in his hand, a farmer's tool against a lawman's gun. And he made the choice. He would not surrender the truth. He would fight. The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire and splintering wood. Ward fired first, the shot gouging a chunk of bark from the oak tree inches from Malachi's head. Malachi shoved Mercy to the ground behind the wide base of the trunk and threw the shovel, a desperate, clumsy act. It spun end over end, striking one of Ward's men in the chest and knocking him from his saddle with a grunt of surprise. The second man fired, his bullet thudding into the earth where Mercy had just been. Malachi scrambled for the fallen man's pistol, his fingers closing around the cool metal just as Ward spurred his horse forward, his face a mask of rage. This was a place of reckoning. The quiet pasture had become a battlefield. Malachi was no gunman, but the primal instinct for survival took over. He fired, the recoil jolting his arm. The shot went wide, but it was enough to make Ward's horse rear in panic, throwing the deputy off balance. The chaos was a blur of shouting, whinnying horses, and the deafening roar of gunshots. Malachi knew they were hopelessly outmatched. He had one pistol with a few rounds against two armed men who killed for a living. He pulled Mercy further behind the tree, the rough bark scraping against their backs. "Stay down!" he yelled over the din. Another bullet whistled past, and he felt a searing pain in his left arm. He glanced down to see blood soaking his sleeve. Adrenaline dulled the pain, but he knew their time was running out. They were pinned, trapped. Ward was back on his feet, advancing cautiously, using the panicked horses as cover. "It's over, Brooke! You can't protect her!" he bellowed. Just as despair began to set in, a new sound cut through the air. It was a high, ululating cry, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was a war cry. From the crest of the ridge where Ward had first appeared, a line of riders materialized as if from thin air. They were not lawmen. They were Cherokee warriors, their faces painted, their movements fluid and silent. At their head was a man with a face like carved granite, his long, graying hair braided with eagle feathers. He sat on his painted pony with an unshakable dignity, a long rifle held across his lap. It was Joseph Crow Feather. Ward and his remaining man froze, their attention diverted by this new, terrifying threat. They were caught between the rancher they had cornered and the silent, imposing figures on the hill. Joseph Crow Feather raised his hand, and his warriors fanned out, their movements perfectly coordinated, encircling the chaotic scene below. They didn't charge, they simply watched, their presence a suffocating weight. They were the silent guardians of this land, and their patience had finally run out. Joseph's voice, when he spoke, was calm, but carried across the field with an authority that dwarfed Ward's blustering threats. "Silas Ward," he said, the name an indictment. "You stand on stolen ground. You defend stolen wealth. You have shed blood to protect a lie. Your time is done." Ward, his face pale with a mixture of fury and fear, turned his pistol toward the new arrivals. "This is official business. You have no right." He was cut off by the sharp crack of a rifle, not from Joseph, but from one of his warriors on the flank. The shot was not aimed to kill. It struck the pistol from Ward's hand, sending it spinning into the grass. He cried out, clutching his numbed fingers. His last man, seeing the impossible odds, threw down his gun and raised his hands in surrender. It was over in an instant. The tide had turned not with a flood but with a quiet, irresistible force. Joseph Crow Feather and his men rode down into the pasture, their horses picking their way carefully around the scene of the conflict. Joseph dismounted and walked directly to the open chest. He looked down at the contents, his face impassive, but his eyes burned with a cold, ancient fire. He looked at the ledger, the deeds, the money, the physical proof of the betrayal his people had endured for years. Then he looked at Malachi and Mercy, who were now emerging from behind the tree. He nodded slowly. "The earth does not forget," he said, his voice low, "and neither do we. We have been watching. We have been waiting. We knew the boy, Thomas Whitmore. He came to us. He told us what he had found. We told him to be careful." His gaze softened with a deep sadness. He was a brave man. He had a warrior's heart. Mercy, her face stained with tears and dirt, stepped forward. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved us." "We saved ourselves," Joseph corrected gently. "And you," he said, his eyes meeting Malachi's. "You chose to stand when you could have run. You bled for a truth that was not your own." Malachi looked down at his bleeding arm, the pain now a dull, insistent throb. He had been thrust into this, a reluctant participant. But Joseph was right. He had made a choice. He had stood his ground. In that moment, an unlikely alliance was forged in blood and purpose. The quiet rancher, the grieving sister, and the dignified Cherokee leader. 3 disparate souls bound together by a common enemy and a shared conviction. They tied up Ward and his men, their sullen silence a testament to their defeat. The decision of what to do next hung heavy in the air. They couldn't go to the local sheriff. He was in Pike's pocket. They couldn't expect help from anyone in a position of authority, because the authority was the source of the corruption. "We ride to town," Mercy declared, her voice ringing with newfound resolve. "We don't hide. We don't wait for them to hunt us down. We take this." She gestured to the chest, "and Thomas's letters, and we show everyone. We confront Pike in the open, in front of the whole town. It was a reckless, desperate plan. It was suicide, but it was also the only way. To fight Pike in the shadows was to lose. Their only weapon was the truth, and a truth untold is no weapon at all." Malachi looked at the determined set of Mercy's jaw, at the quiet strength in Joseph's eyes. He felt the sting of his own wound, a physical reminder of his commitment. The fortress of his solitude was a ruin, and from its rubble, something new was being built. "Yes," Malachi said, the words sealing their pact. "We ride to redemption." They knew what it meant. They were no longer just unearthing a secret. They were declaring war on the man who had buried it. As they prepared to leave, securing the chest and tending to Malachi's arm, the weight of their decision settled upon them. They were riding from the wild, open spaces where truth had been found, directly into the heart of a town built on lies, a town ruled by fear. They were 3 people against a tyrant, and the road ahead led straight to a confrontation that would either liberate a community or get them all killed. The ride to redemption was a pilgrimage of ghosts and grim resolve. They moved across the plains not as a posse, but as a somber procession. Malachi, his arm bandaged tightly, rode beside Mercy. Joseph Crow Feather and a dozen of his best warriors followed at a respectful distance, a silent, formidable shadow that stretched long behind them. They didn't speak much. The vast sky and the endless, rolling land seemed to demand silence. Malachi could feel the thrum of the horse beneath him, the steady, familiar rhythm a counterpoint to the chaotic hammering of his own heart. He was a man of the earth, of solitude and quiet observation. Now he was riding toward a crowd, toward a public declaration that would shatter the town's fragile peace. He kept glancing at Mercy. The grief was still etched on her face, but it was now overlaid with a steely determination that seemed to draw strength from the open landscape itself. She was her brother's sister, carrying his legacy forward not as a burden, but as a banner. Joseph's presence was a different kind of strength, ancient, patient, and implacable. He was the living memory of the injustice, the embodiment of a history that Pike had tried to erase. The stolen money, the fraudulent deeds. To Malachi, they were proof of a crime. To Joseph, they were insults carved into the very soul of his people. As the sun began to set, the dusty outlines of redemption appeared on the horizon. The town looked small from a distance, a fragile collection of wooden buildings huddled together against the immensity of the plains. It seemed impossible that such a small place could hold so much corruption, so much fear. The closer they got, the more the tension coiled in Malachi's gut. This was Judge Pike's domain. Every street, every building was under his shadow. They were riding into the lion's den, carrying the bones of his crimes. Their plan, conceived in the adrenaline-fueled aftermath of the shootout, now seemed terrifyingly thin. What if the townspeople didn't listen? What if they were too afraid to stand with them? Pike's power wasn't just in his armed enforcers, it was in the silence he had cultivated, the fear that kept good people looking the other way. They reached the edge of town as twilight bled across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. Joseph held up a hand, halting the procession. "We do this in the light," he said, his voice calm and steady. "We will wait for morning. Let the town wake up to a new day. Let them see the truth in the clear light of the sun." It was a wise decision. A confrontation in the dark would be a brawl, easily dismissed as the work of outlaws. A reckoning in the daylight, in the middle of the town square, would be a spectacle. It would force people to look, to listen, to choose a side. They made a cold camp just outside of town, the distant lights of redemption flickering like wary eyes. Mercy unfolded the letters from her brother, his neat handwriting a stark contrast to the grim reality they faced. She read them aloud again, this time not in grief, but in preparation. They were memorizing their ammunition. Malachi listened, the words weaving together with the chirping of crickets and the soft rustle of the wind. Thomas Whitmore had been more than a clerk. He had been a chronicler of Pike's sins. His letters detailed names, dates, and conversations he had overheard. They painted a damning portrait of a man who used his judicial robes to cloak a tyrant's greed. One name appeared several times in the letters: Clarabelle, the schoolteacher. Thomas had written of her quiet courage, her sharp mind. He had trusted her, confided in her. "Clarabelle," Mercy said, folding the letters carefully. "She's our first step. If Thomas trusted her, we can too." As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in soft pastels, A single rider broke from Joseph's warriors and slipped into town, a silent messenger. Their target was the schoolhouse. The rest of them waited, the tension a living thing in the cool morning air. It was a gamble. Everything depended on this one woman. An hour later, the rider returned. He nodded to Joseph. The message had been delivered. Clarabelle was waiting. The time had come. They rode into Redemption not from the main road but down the side streets, avoiding the sheriff's office. The town was just beginning to stir. Shopkeepers were sweeping their boardwalks, their movements slow and routine. A few early risers stopped and stared as the strange procession passed. The wounded rancher, the determined woman, and the silent, imposing Cherokee leader. They were an incongruous, threatening sight. An omen of a day that would be anything but ordinary. They stopped in the center of the town square, directly in front of the courthouse, a pompous brick building that served as Judge Pike's fortress. Malachi dismounted, his movements stiff. He walked to the horse that carried the chest and unstrapped it, placing it on the ground with a solid, definitive thud. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet square. People began to emerge from the shops and houses, drawn by the spectacle. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity and fear. They saw Malachi Brooke, the recluse from the plains. They saw Joseph Crowfeather, a man most of them tried to pretend didn't exist, and they saw the chest. A door opened on the second floor of the courthouse. Judge Harrison Pike stepped out onto the balcony, a cup of coffee in his hand. He was a large man, accustomed to looking down on the world. His face, usually a mask of smug authority, registered a flicker of surprise, then hardened into a scowl of pure fury when he saw who stood below. He recognized the chest instantly. His composure cracked. "What is the meaning of this?" he boomed, his voice accustomed to instant obedience. "Sheriff, arrest these hooligans!" But the sheriff was nowhere to be seen. At that moment, a woman walked out from the crowd. She was plain dressed, but carried herself with an unshakable dignity. It was Clarabelle, the schoolteacher. In her hands, she held a sheaf of papers, Thomas Whitmore's letters. She walked to the center of the square, her eyes fixed on the judge. "There will be no arrests today, Judge Pike," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the square. "There will only be a reading." Pike's face went white. He knew what those letters contained. "That woman is hysterical! She's spreading lies!" he shouted, his voice betraying a hint of panic. But it was too late. The stage was set. The audience was gathered. Clarabelle began to read. The first letter described Thomas's initial suspicions, his discovery of the missing funds. The crowd murmured, their fear beginning to mingle with a dawning anger. They had all paid taxes. They had all felt the squeeze of Pike's iron-fisted rule. Pike screamed for his deputies, and Silas Ward, his hand bandaged, emerged from the courthouse with a half-dozen armed men. They moved to surround the square, their presence a blunt threat. But the townspeople didn't scatter. They held their ground, their attention riveted by Clarabelle's voice. She read on, her voice filled with Thomas's earnest horror as he uncovered the depth of the deception. The land deeds, the swindling of the Cherokee. As she spoke of the tribe's plight, Joseph Crowfeather stepped forward. He didn't speak with anger, but with a profound, sorrowful authority. "For generations, we have been told to trust the white man's law," he began, his voice resonating with the weight of his ancestors. "We signed treaties. We were promised provisions. We were promised dignity. Judge Pike took your money, yes, but he used it to steal our history. He used it to turn our sacred lands into his personal fortune. This," he said, gesturing to the chest, "is the price of our trust, the price of our suffering." His words landed like stones in the hearts of the townspeople. They were no longer just hearing about stolen money. They were witnessing the desecration of a people. The moral lines were being drawn, stark and undeniable. Finally, it was Malachi's turn. He was not a speaker. He was a man of action, of quiet truth. He stepped forward, kicked open the lid of the chest, and overturned it. The contents spilled out onto the dusty ground, the bundles of cash, the government bonds, the neatly tied land deeds. It was an avalanche of proof. The physical, undeniable evidence of Pike's greed lay bare for all to see. The crowd gasped. The abstract crime described in the letters was now a real, tangible thing at their feet. The confrontation had reached its peak. The moral authority of the judge was shattered, dismantled piece by a dead man's words, a tribal leader's testimony, and a rancher's quiet resolve. Pike, trapped on his balcony, his face contorted with hate and desperation, finally snapped. His veneer of judicial calm evaporated, revealing the tyrant beneath. He drew a pistol, his hand trembling with rage. "Lies! All of it!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. He didn't aim at the stoic Joseph or the grim Malachi. He aimed at Mercy. She was the heart of it, the catalyst, the grieving sister who had refused to be silent. You started this!" he screamed. In that horrifying, suspended moment, as Pike's finger tightened on the trigger, a sound erupted from the edge of the square. It was a furious, powerful neigh, a sound of pure animal rage. Sterling, the horse who had started it all, had been tethered loosely by Malachi. He had been watching, his intelligent eyes fixed on the scene. At the sight of the gun pointed at Mercy, at the sound of Pike's screeching voice, something broke in him. He tore free from his tether, his powerful muscles coiling. With a sound like a thunderclap, he charged. He wasn't just running, he was a silver-gray projectile of natural justice, his hooves tearing up the ground. He galloped straight for the courthouse steps, a primal force of nature unleashed upon the corrupt order of men. The crowd scattered in terror and awe. Pike, startled by the sudden chaos, flinched. His shot went wild, firing harmlessly into the sky. Sterling didn't slow. He crashed up the wooden steps of the courthouse porch, the structure groaning under his weight. He reared, his front hooves smashing through the balcony railing right in front of the judge. Pike screamed, a pathetic, terrified sound, and stumbled backward, tripping and falling in a heap inside his own courthouse. The charge had broken the standoff. It shattered the last vestige of Pike's authority. In the ensuing chaos, Joseph's warriors moved with swift, silent efficiency, disarming Ward and his stunned men. The townspeople, their fear finally burned away by a collective surge of courage, surged forward. They didn't wait for an outside authority. They didn't wait for a federal marshal. They stormed the courthouse themselves, their anger a righteous tide, and dragged the whimpering, defeated Judge Pike out into the sunlight. Justice had not been delivered from on high. It had been unearthed from the ground and won by the hands of the very people it was meant to serve. A somber, fragile peace settled over redemption in the days that followed. It was the quiet of a fever that has finally broken, leaving the body weak but cleansed. The town square, the stage for their revolution, was swept clean, but the memory of what had happened there lingered in the air, a permanent change in the atmosphere. Federal marshals eventually arrived, summoned by a telegraph from a neighboring town, but they found their work largely done. Judge Pike and Silas Ward were already in the town jail, their power evaporated, their faces sullen masks of defeat. The townspeople, once cowed and silent, gave their testimonies with a newfound steady courage. They were no longer subjects of a tyrant. They were citizens who had reclaimed their own dignity. The chest and its contents were taken as official evidence, the stolen wealth destined to be returned to the U.S. Treasury and from there, rightfully allocated to the Cherokee Nation. It was a slow, bureaucratic process, but the first, most important step had been taken. A public ceremony was held in that same square. It wasn't a celebration, but a memorial. Thomas Whitmore was honored not as a victim, but as the hero who had lit the first candle in the darkness. Mercy stood before the town, her brother's last letter in her hand, and spoke of his belief in the fundamental goodness of people, a belief that had been vindicated by their collective action. Her voice didn't tremble. It was the clear, strong voice of a leader. Joseph Crowfeather stood with her, a silent testament to the new, fragile bridge being built between two communities. He didn't speak of grievances, but of a shared future, A future where truth was not a buried secret, but a common foundation. Malachi stood at the back of the crowd, uncomfortable with the attention, with the grateful glances sent his way. He had not sought to be a hero. He had only sought to quiet the knocking at his door. He watched Mercy speak, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. He saw not just a grieving sister, but a woman of incredible strength and grace. In her, he saw a reason to stay connected to the world he had for so long tried to shut out. When the ceremony was over, she found him by the stables, where he was tending to Sterling. The great horse nudged Malachi's hand, then Mercy's, a quiet acknowledgement from the story's true catalyst. "You're not going back to your ranch right away, are you?" Mercy asked, her voice soft. "There's still so much to do here, to rebuild." "Rebuilding isn't my trade," he said, his old habit of deflecting, of retreating, rising to the surface. "You unearthed more than just a chest, Malachi," she said, her eyes meeting his. "You helped this town unearth its own courage. You helped me find justice when I thought all I would find was a grave. You don't get to just disappear again." He looked away from her intense gaze, out toward the plains that had once been his only solace. They looked different now. Not empty, but open, full of possibility. His isolation had been a fortress, but he was beginning to realize it had also been a prison. He had fought for this community, he had bled for it. Whether he liked it or not, he was a part of it now. Trust, home, love. He had learned they were not things you found, but things you built, one splinter and scar at a time. He had his share of scars now, inside and out. But for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel like marks of loss. They felt like the foundations of a new life. "No," he said, turning back to her, a slow, small smile touching his lips. "I guess I don't." The peace that settled over him was not the hollow quiet of solitude he had once mistaken for peace. It was something richer, more complex. It was the hard-earned peace of a man who had faced the world and found his place in it. It was the feeling of coming home, not to a plot of land, but to a purpose, and to the promise of a future shared with others. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the town. Redemption was no longer just a name on a map. It was a promise, scarred but stronger. A community that had stared into the abyss of its own fear and had found the courage to build its own vindication, its own hard-won freedom.